When I first met my friend Scott back in the 1980s, I thought he seemed a little too nice. It almost seemed like he was trying too hard. And as it turns out, he really was trying hard. I guess when your job involves being the opposite of nice, you tend to overcompensate in your social life. And in Scott's job, he was anything but nice. Scott and I used to play chess every week. He won about 3 out of 5 games, but always complimented me on playing a good game regardless of the outcome. That's just the kind of guy Scott is. Modest in victory, gracious in defeat, always kept things in perspective. Back in the 1970s, before Pablo Escobar became a household name and the American media glamorized drug traffickers, there was a prolific group of smugglers headed by a man known as Little Ray Thompson. During the late 70s and early 80s, Thompson's group smuggled millions of pounds of marijuana into Fort Lauderdale through the Amity Yacht Center, netting nearly $1 billion in just 2 years, according to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Thompson's group was so successful that on February 21st, 1989, PBS aired a frontline documentary titled Who Profits from Drugs, in which they profiled Thompson's organization. In that documentary, they interviewed Detective Lonnie Cooper from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, who said that Ray Thompson's organization was run by 2 main components. One was fear and the other was money. Well, the money came from drug profits, but my friend Scott provided the fear. But who would fear my soft-spoken, college-educated, 5'9", 165-pound friend Scott, the nice guy who would go out of his way just to find out how you were doing? In August of 1980, 2 members of Thompson's group began working outside the organization. Bobby Vaught and Bill Harris had decided to go on their own, and by doing so, they were cutting into Little Ray's business. Ray couldn't negotiate acceptable departure terms with Bill and Bobby, so Scott, his co-worker Pat, and 2 other associates tied them up, put them on a boat, took them a few miles out to sea, where they were each shot in the head and dumped overboard. Their bodies, weighted down with anchors and chains, were never found. A couple of months later, Scott was arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard in the Bahamas with other members of the group who were found on board a yacht carrying 18,000 pounds of marijuana. Little Ray hired lawyers for him and arranged for their release from jail. Then in 1981, the police raided the Amity Yacht Center. They seized 30,000 pounds of Little Ray's marijuana. Ray avoided arrest, but just barely, and he knew it. He was worried about law enforcement watching his financial transactions, and he had $500,000 in cash that he needed to put somewhere. Ray called a trusted friend, a former jockey named Jimmy Savoy. Savoy owned a cabinet shop, and Ray wanted to have a safe installed in the shop floor so he could stash money there. Ray had been friends with Jimmy for almost 20 years. Jimmy was a clean guy, so investigators would have no reason to be looking at him. But there really are no trusted friends in the world of crime, and Jimmy Savoy proved that. One night he got a jackhammer and broke the safe out of the floor, cut it open. Then he left Florida with Ray's money and partied like a rock star. My friends Scott and Pat caught up with Jimmy Savoy less than a year later, and on a boat in the Atlantic Ocean off Port Everglades, on a cool March evening in 1982, Little Ray Thompson shot his friend Jimmy in the back of the head. His body was dumped in the ocean and has never been seen again. Scott was convicted of smuggling for the Bahamas arrest, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but he had no intention of surrendering to serve that time. Still out on bond, he fled the U.S. using a fake passport. He went to London, England with a suitcase packed with cash. He was taking it to a money launderer who would process it through a few corporations, countries, and banks, and finally back to Scott, who could then spend it while he was living a life as a fugitive. But it didn't work out that way. When Scott tried to leave England on a flight to Spain, he was stopped at Heathrow Airport and arrested by Scotland Yard detectives. Eventually, Scott was extradited back to the U.S. to stand trial for kidnapping Jimmy Savoy and killing Vaught and Harris. Little Ray Thompson was arrested for killing Jimmy. Pat hired a famous attorney named F. Lee Bailey who got him the deal of the century, but that's a story for another video. At Scott's trial, the evidence was scarce. No bodies, no guns, no blood. Only the testimony from people who had made deals to save themselves in exchange for testifying against Scott and Little Ray. Of nearly 100 people involved in the Little Ray Thompson smuggling organization, only 4 didn't testify for the state. 1 committed suicide. 1 fled to a small but beautiful country in South America where he bought a modest but comfortable home to spend his twilight years as a wanted fugitive, complaining about the quality of his internet connection. The other 2, Ray and Scott, they went to trial and took their chances. Ray was sentenced to death for killing Jimmy Savoy. The state seized the Amity Yacht Center, all of Ray's houses, his Corvettes, his 10 yachts, including the 58-foot Hatteras used in the killings. Scott's trial ended in a hung jury. 11 of the 12 jurors voted to acquit him, but one was determined to convict. A mistrial was declared, and in 1992, at his retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 20 years. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 84 years old. I write Scott a letter every 4 or 5 years. He always responds. He always refuses my offers to send him money. But you know the old saying, no body, no crime? That's bullshit.